Hello, and thank you so much for being with us today with our introduction to the ONO-4685 with Principal Investigator Dr. Stephen Horwitz, medical oncologist, member and attending physician at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for being with us today, Dr. Horwitz.
Thank you, Holly. It's great to be with you. Nice to see you. Thanks.
It's nice to see you as well. So why don't we start with setting the stage, who you are, your practice in clinic and clinical trials, and let's set the framework and then we'll go from there talking about this specific one.
Great. Yeah. No, I'm a medical oncologist, so I'm not a dermatologist, medical oncologist, and I work at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a big cancer center here in New York. My focus is on lymphoma, and I really pretty much specifically or almost exclusively see people with T-cell lymphomas. So I direct our T-cell lymphoma program here, and that's a group we have with 6 medical oncologists, 2 dermatologists, pathologists, researchers, et cetera, strong support teams who really focus on the care of patients with T-cell lymphomas, both cutaneous and non-cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, and also studying those diseases, trying to understand more about the diseases with a strong emphasis on trying to understand or develop new therapies for those diseases. So that's really my focus. My kind of week, I have, it's sort of split between research and patient care. I have 2 days of a week where I see patients. We call it clinic. And those are full days where we see patients. The patients with skin lymphomas, we usually see jointly with our dermatologist. The multidisciplinary clinic is embedded to that. And then there are some patients with systemic T-cell lymphomas who also are in there. Our approach is that there's an unmet need for better therapies for this group of patients. And there's a lot of overlap in terms of skin or cutaneous T-cell lymphomas and other types of T-cell lymphomas where a lot of the therapies for one makes sense for the other. So we kind of try to help that larger group of patients with care and patient-based research.
So when it comes to this specific clinical trial, can you walk me through what's different about it? General information, why this one, who this is designed for, what type of disease, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as you know, and the audience may know, T-cell lymphomas are rare. And partly because they're rare, we try not to be, but we're often, maybe a step behind other cancers in terms of more common diseases that where there's just a larger collective effort in terms of developing or trying to understand new therapies. And one of the therapies that's really fundamentally changed the way a lot of cancers are treated, particularly B-cell lymphomas, which are still lymphomas but of a different cell type, are immune-based therapies. And immune-based therapies can be antibodies, so proteins that bind to the cancer cells that help the immune system fight the cancer cell. And we have medicines like that. Mogamulizumab, for some of this audience may be familiar, that's an antibody. So you get the antibody and your normal immune system can then recognize and try to attack the Sezary cells or the mycosis fungoides cells. But the other areas that have really changed a lot of what happens for patients with B-cell lymphoma are T-cell directed therapies. And those really are therapies where your normal T cells are either encouraged or stimulated or genetically rearranged to fight the B-cell cancer or other type of cancer. And that's really fundamentally changed the outcome for different groups of patients with B-cell lymphomas. The way that's done are really 2 basic types. One is called CAR T cells. So that's where the normal T cells are taken out of the body and they're genetically rearranged so they fight a specific or recognize a specific target on a cancer cell and then attack and destroy that cancer cell. And then there's something called bispecific antibodies or T-cell engagers. And that's where you're not doing anything outside the body, but inside the body, you have one end of the molecule, sort of like an antibody, so it can attach to the cancer cell. And then other than non-specifically recruiting T cells, the other end of the antibody binds to T cells. So it brings the T cell, I don't know if I'm doing this with my hands, into contact with the cancer cell. So rather than them just having to bump into each other, become circulated, it actually brings that interaction. And those are more potent therapies against B-cell lymphomas and other cancers. So we know those are ways to make the therapy more potent than antibody therapies alone, where just an antibody binds. More potency can be better in terms of good effects. It can be worse in terms of toxicity. And each molecule or product you kind of have to study in that context and understand how that works and things like that. So maybe not surprisingly, it's turned out that it's much more complicated to get good T cells to fight bad T cells than it is to get good T cells to fight other cells.
Mm.
And some of that is the commonality between what we call the effector cell, the cell that's going to do the damage or going to kill the cancer cell, and the cancer cell itself. And we could talk more about that. But what this study is looking at is it's taking, if I haven't jumped ahead too far, it's taking a protein called PD-1, which is on the surface of most cells of Sezary syndrome or mycosis fungoides. It's also on the surface of other T cell lymphomas and on the surface of some normal T cells. And one end of the molecule attaches to that, and the other end attaches on called CD3, which is a T cell engager. So it binds normal T cells, or hopefully normal T cells, and brings those into contact with the cancer cells. So it's one of the first attempts to try to use T cell directed therapy or get good T cells to fight cancer, in this case, a T cell lymphoma. So it's one of the first to look at this bispecific antibody approach and apply that to a T cell lymphoma.
Who is this designed for? So maybe you can help our viewers better understand who this might be appropriate for.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at that. One is disease types. One is the state of the disease stage, where you are in your disease journey. So I'll start with that second part first. So this is a systemic therapy. It's given intravenously. The first couple doses are given in the hospital because when you activate the immune system against the cancer, you're looking for all the good effects of what's really a potent response. The immune system is very good at killing things in your body that shouldn't be there. But the risk of that is that the immune system can accelerate, can release things into the blood called cytokines. These can cause fever, they can cause low blood pressure, they can cause shortness of breath, they can cause sometimes neurologic changes that need to be treated quickly. And there's medicines that we can give in the hospital to do that. So there's things called cytokine release or other complications of these immune-based therapies. So it's a significant therapy that has the potential to really eradicate or really attack the lymphoma, but also has a small chance of a serious risk. So it's for people where that kind of treatment makes sense. So I look at that as people who, one, need systemic therapy. Many people with skin lymphomas are well served with skin-directed therapies only, which, while not curing you, and we're all frustrated by that, don't really expose the person to any significant risk of a dangerous side effect. They can be annoying, they can be irritating, they can be costly, they can be endless, but the risk of a life-threatening side effect is very low. So it would be someone who needed a therapy or a response commensurate with that risk. So I usually look at those are people with disease inside the body, where the disease is behaving in a dangerous way, severe or really damaging skin disease where there's infections or there's real risk from the skin lymphoma. And in people who some of the standard therapies that we well understand the safety and how well they work haven't worked well enough. It doesn't mean every standard therapy, but things that we know pretty well, even of the systemic therapies, the brentuximab vedotins, the mogamulizumab, where we have a lot of experience with and can work well and are quite safe. Things where those things have been tried and didn't work or for some reason don't make sense for that patient. So it needs to be that level. I'll jump back for a second. This is a phase 1 study. So phase 1, first in human, dose escalation. So the primary endpoints of a phase 1 study are really to define dose and safety before you can understand how well they work. So we're there. We're pretty far along in this, and this study's, because of some of the risk, has been very conservative in giving a little more, a little more, a little more. And to date, we've not seen very many of that, what we call cytokine release, or some of those more concerning side effects. And when you don't get those too strongly and you're paid for them, you can treat them and fix them. And that's part of these therapies. So we're going along that course, but it's that line of early stage study. So people that have a disease where that risk benefit ratio makes sense. And sometimes that's defined by the individual, but I think as physicians, there's like a global sense, right? If you could take an oral retinoid and go to phototherapy twice a week and you're in good shape, it doesn't make medical sense to do an in-hospital therapy that has some real risk. As I'm saying that, I realize I don't want to scare people away from this because we're always really cautious. And, the reason you get that support is so if any of those risks occur, they don't translate into real harm. But this is what can happen when we're studying new medicines. So the other thing is the target of the therapy is a marker, a molecule on the surface of cells called PD-1, which is on a lot of T cell lymphoma cells and some normal T cells. So you want a lymphoma that expresses PD-1 because if you don't have the target, the likelihood of benefit is quite a bit less. So in the skin lymphoma world, that would be mycosis fungoides and Sezary syndrome as almost universally having PD-1 on their surface. Some of the rare, what we call cytotoxic T cell lymphomas, the gamma delta T cell lymphomas, or the aggressive CD8 cytotoxic T, those are less likely to have PD-1 on the surface. So of the skin lymphoma patients, it's more common MF and Sezary who would be the most likely candidates for this. But it's something that is checked in pathology on people's biopsies routinely, and it's not hard to look for if that was ever a question.
Okay. So if a person has come across our website or they're considering, let's first back up to somebody just in general considering clinical trials, right? I think that that's a good place to start before we
Yeah,
talk about this one specifically.
sure. Yeah, those are big decisions. It's a big deal to participate in a clinical trial, and I think a lot of people have very different personal feelings. I can tell you, mostly in oncology and certainly in the research we do, the trials are therapeutic, so almost never is there a placebo, and if there is, you're told. We pick treatments that we think will answer a question and improve therapy in a certain way. So, you know, the trials that we do are mostly designed by physicians, sometimes in conjunction with a company or a biotech company or a pharmaceutical company who is making a product. But the goal is to figure out something better for treating patients. And for us as a medical oncologist, where our population is maybe a little bit slanted towards more advanced disease, often that is finding new therapies for people who don't have effective therapies available or who have exhausted effective therapies. And then in those studies, we're really looking at what we call efficacy, better responses or responses after other things haven't worked.
Mm.
But a study could look at a safer therapy. So we've sometimes done studies where it's a similar therapy. We think the way it works is similar to another treatment, but could it be done in a safer way or a way that has less side effects? Might you dose it or add to it in a way that you're trying to make it safer or more convenient or longer lasting? I think that's the other thing we think about a lot in the cutaneous T cell lymphoma space is that we have a number of therapies, but they tend to be ongoing and the responses tend not to last a real long time after you stop. So sometimes studies in this disease are to try to make the treatment work longer. So I think if you're thinking about a study, one is the question, am I inadequately being treated with what I'm doing now?
Mhm.
And then articulate what is that? Sometimes we see people like, I hate going to light therapy 3 times a week. It's just a really drag on my day. That doesn't mean you should be hospitalized for a phase 1 first in human study of a medicine that has real risks. That means that, I don't know, maybe you either, adjust your light schedule or something like that. But articulate in what way am I not being served? Now, if the disease is growing and not controlled, I think that's obvious. If the disease is under some reasonable control, then that's the question is, what would make it better? And is that more effective therapy so the disease is under better control? Is it less frequent therapy? Is it a side effect that this medicine has that I really can't stand and this other thing might lead? But there should be some way to try to do better than what you're currently doing. And I think that's a reasonable point to start. I think when you talk to your physician about that, there's always, we talk about rationale and alternatives. So the question would be, okay, we say sometimes all decisions are based on the alternative. So if I didn't do that, what would I do and what would that look like? And then you're not saying, should I just do this? You're saying, should I do this or should I do this? And you're making kind of a comparative decision. And then usually then we talk about risks. What are those risks? And in a very general way, risks fall into 2 buckets. What are likely side effects that I may have? And what are unlikely but dangerous side effects that I might have? And I think both of those are impactful because some medicines are very unlikely to have a dangerous risk, but they might have a day-to-day side effect that really affects quality of life. Um, and looking at both of those things to get a full picture of making a decision, and then usually like the last thing that we think about often when you walk through this is the schedule. What does my day-to-day life look like of this study? How often am I coming in? What additional tests do I need by participating in the study? Things like things.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And then, you touched on the fact that there are quite a few therapies available for people with cutaneous lymphomas, depending on their variant and otherwise. Why one more? Why this particular ONO-4685? Why put the energy behind the development of this particular possible new
Yeah.
therapy?
Yeah, I mean, one nice thing about being a clinical investigator is all our eggs are not in one basket, so we can pursue multiple studies. So I would just say for where we sit, it's not this one, it's this in addition to other things we're studying. And I think the promise is when we've seen in B cell lymphomas that there are people with bispecific antibodies who go into complete remission. And we're now learning that some of those people stay in remission 1, 2, 3 years, maybe more off of therapy. And we don't really have therapies like that in T cell lymphoma or cutaneous T cell lymphoma, other than things like allotransplant. Like most of our therapies, when they work, you stay on them. And if you stop them, the disease usually, not always, comes back within months to a year. So we don't have therapies that we think in general put people into long-term remission. And this same technology, though not the same therapy, in B-cell lymphomas have put people into long remission. So it's a therapy when other things haven't worked. And the immune therapies, because the immune system is in your body, do at least hold out the promise of creating these long remissions off of therapy. And I think the wins, if this is successful, could be another therapy when other things haven't worked, but also potentially something that could be much more durable. Now, we're short of understanding that now. The study's ongoing and we're still doing dose finding and stuff like that. But that would be the hope with this technology. But at least initially, this would be for people who had advanced disease and had exhausted most of the standard therapies, or most of the patients we're treating with skin lymphomas or other systemic T cell lymphomas. If we learn down the road that the effectiveness is quite good, and oh, by the way, we learn how to give it safely so the risk is low, and as a third step, we see that people are really in remission a long time off of therapy, that would be more of a game-changing advance. And then that's when you say, oh, well, should we start moving this into earlier lines of therapy?
Yeah.
If it's really better, not just in addition to, but you kind of got to walk that walk to understand how it works, how safe it is, what are the long-term benefits, and then think about maybe where it fits in a like a treatment continuum. As we say, research is always incremental. It's always slower than we want it to, but it's mostly forward. Even if it's too slow, you kind of got to understand those things as you move forward.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier on in our discussion that while in phase one, you're quite a ways into your phase one,
Yeah.
and that you're seeing promising results. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a little uncomfortable to talk about unpublished results
Yeah,
in
I'm sorry.
public because it's all in context. But I'd say we are at doses where we're seeing the treatment do what we hope it would do.
Okay.
We're not seeing zero risk, but we're seeing effects on the tumor cells and things like that. And I think we're going to get a real chance to understand how well this works. We think we can give it pretty safely, not risk-free. We think we're seeing it kill cancer cells and things like that. And then more to come to try to understand, like really define how well it works, what are the safety risks and things like that, and then treat more people at sort of those optimal doses and try to define how it works in these lymphomas.
Excellent. So next steps, things we should be keeping an eye on from on the horizon with regards to this therapy, time
Yeah,
wise. What are your thoughts?
I don't study's ongoing. It's available at multiple places, so it's accessible. I think the colleagues who are running the study all have quite good judgment, and if someone reached out, I think they would appropriately counsel patients on whether this is an appropriate therapy for them. It is IV weekly, so it is a bit of a commitment, but for people who need new therapies, I think it makes a lot of sense. And then I think as we go, I don't think we have like a data cut time point or a projection of when there would be public reporting or things like that. But I think the study's ongoing, and sort of how it goes and what we see would sort of determine when there'd be some presentation data at one of the main meetings. But I don't have a true rate or a sense of time frame of when that would be.
Is there anything else that a person living with cutaneous lymphoma or somebody who loves somebody who has cutaneous
Yeah.
lymphoma should know about this particular clinical trial and where we are today, and where they would go to engage more with a physician?
Yeah, I think, do you have on the website
We
the
do.
site's open? Yeah, so I think so again, I would say someone who needs new therapy and therapy that would be appropriate for intravenous, not just skin directed therapy, someone who needs something more advanced than that, I think it's worth a conversation about. And I would look at those centers that are doing the study. It's probably best, you could talk with your physician about, is a therapy like this appropriate in general? And most people's oncologists, while they may not be familiar with this specific trial, because it's it's just being done right now in T-cell lymphomas, they'll certainly know the concept of bispecific antibodies and would that type of therapy be appropriate for your stage and time point in your disease. And then I think it's probably best to talk with someone at one of the study sites who's doing the study, because there's a lot of more nuanced discussion that you would have if you're talking about an individual, what it would look like if you were actually on that study. Would you really be eligible to participate in, and does that make medical and logistic sense for you to do? So I think it would be reasonable to reach out, but I probably would go through those steps.
Yeah, no, that sounds like sound guidance, and we do. We have the clinical trial listed on the foundation's website, and somebody can just search up the clinical trial number ONO-4685, and we also have a news and insight page about this clinical trial, and this video will live on that news and insights,
Okay.
as well as any additional updates that come down the pike, any press releases and things of that nature. We'll be sure to be adding those there. And I'm sure we'll be circling back with you at some point
Yeah.
to do an update on where we are when we move from phase 1 to phase 2. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we want to cover today?
I mean, I think on this topic, I think that's pretty thorough. But I also think the concept of clinical trials is really, it's kind of how the disease moves for how the treatment and how the field moves forward. So, I think it's reasonable for patients at different points in decision making to think about, is there a trial that would be appropriate? And if that feels too scary, it's never required. If it feels like an opportunity to try something that might be newer, different, or better, then maybe that's a good fit, and you could kind of explore those things as treatment decisions come up.
It sounds like sound advice.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you very much, Dr. Horwitz, for joining us today and giving us a little insight on this clinical trial. We appreciate your time. We know how busy you are and that your time is very valuable. So thank you very much for joining us. So thank you so much for your time today, and we'll be circling back with updates later.
Thanks, Holly. Always a pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care.